a husband, a powerful husband someday. So he didn't want nobody to challenge him for the throne, so he went and killed his cousin. So now you have, later after Alexander dies, what happens was, before he died, he promised his sister that, she would marry this powerful lieutenant. Oh, I forget his name, but he was a guy who really helped out Alexander throughout his whole rulership. And he was really loyal to Alexander, so he wanted to reward him with marrying his sister, but he got sick and he died before that could even happen. Now, again, we have fast forward to where now you have Perdiccas being the regent and running the kingdom in Alexander's place. So Kinene, who is a powerful warrior, she is very powerful, and she understands that, she would have been queen at some point and would have been ruling had her husband been alive. That would have been able to take his place. So now she doesn't have a husband to step into that place or anything like that. So she focused her time on her daughter. Now, Kinene, as I said, was a warrior. She commanded armies. She was no joke. She defeated the Illyrian army and she killed the queen, with her own hands. Everybody knew about her. She was very well respected. Now, she had plans of her own. She had a daughter, Eurydice, who she wanted to marry to her uncle, who was the one who was slow, Aridaeus, who was her brother. So she wanted her daughter to marry her brother, which would be her uncle, her daughter's uncle. So her plan was to go ahead, take her daughter to Macedonia to marry her uncle. And basically she would have, some stake on the throne that was basically stolen away from her by her brother. So her proposal was she was going to go there, make it happen. And because she had respect and people liked her, it probably would have happened. So on her way there, of course, you had Perdiccas, who understood that if I let her, who is really a rightful heir to the throne, instill some kind of power in the kingdom, it would create problems for him. She would be watching his every move. So what he did was he went and sent his brother out to intercept her on her way there. And he ended up killing Kinene, who was a great warrior. He ended up killing her. Don't know exactly how, but he got the job done and he killed her. So because she had so much respect and a lot of people really respected her and revered her, and she was a good warrior, it kind of backfired on her because the council basically ruled that Eurydice, her daughter, could still go ahead and marry her uncle, Aridaeus. Even though he was slow, he wasn't that slow. He can, sort of comprehend a little bit, but he wasn't really mentally fit enough to run an entire kingdom. But she went on ahead and married her uncle, and they got married. And now, of course, she was basically, trying to really pull his strings and control his little bit of power that he did have, which of course she wanted him to have more power he had, she had. So this was her game to really try to get his level up and to get the council and the people to recognize that he is a true heir. Even though he's slow, he deserves the respect of having more power than what he had. So Eurydice will eventually marry her uncle, Aridaeus, but Aridaeus would change his name to Philip III. So Aridaeus would become Philip III. He would marry his niece, Eurydice, and they would basically become a small power in the Macedonian Empire, which of course Perdiccas definitely feared and did not like. And he knew he had to eventually do something about that. So what happened was you had Perdiccas, who was sending out Alexander the Great's body. I understand this whole marriage and everything that happened. All this stuff happened within the same year Alexander died, the marriage and everything. So you had a little bit later, you had Perdiccas sending out the body of Alexander the Great to basically go be buried where he was crowned king. So right where he was crowned king, his body was supposed to be buried. But remember, as I said, the other Diadochi was against him. One of them being Ptolemy the First Soter. What Ptolemy the First Soter did was go and steal the body from the men who was transporting Alexander's body. So now after he stole Alexander's body, was buried in Alexandria, Egypt, which we know Ptolemy the First Soter was the one who was crowned king or pharaoh of Egypt. So, of course, after he stole the body, Perdiccas wasn't having that. So he basically set up an army to basically go in and invade Egypt and start a war with Ptolemy the First Soter. So here you have two of the Diadochi, two Greek warriors, soldiers in the army of Alexander who started the fight against each other, and you had this war start to break out. The problem was Perdiccas wasn't as sharp as Ptolemy, and he was arrogant and he was crazy. So his battle plans, his military strategy was whack. He couldn't even cross the Nile and get into the main areas where he needed to strike. And his battle plans and his strategy was horrible. And every time his men failed, he would, execute them. He would treat them like crap. And eventually they got tired of it. So what happened was a few of his lieutenants, his leaders, came together and basically ended up killing him. So here you have the regent, basically almost the king almost, who is in place of Alexander. And this dude invades Egypt, which kind of pissed everybody else off. Then he wasn't even able to make a dent into Egypt. And he was basically killing off his own men because of his incompetence. And his generals and his commanders or what have you, they just didn't like it. It was disrespectful. And they basically came together and they ended up killing him. So basically one of those commanders was Seleucus. And Seleucus would eventually get some land of his own and began the Seleucid Empire. Anybody who does any research on ancient history know about the Seleucid Empire. You can't miss it. So understand that's where that comes into play. And again, so much history, as I said, that you start breaking down once you understand just this part in these stories. So the whole Seleucid Empire came about because Seleucus was one of the commanders that killed Perdiccas, one of the first, or considered the first Diadochi successor of Alexander the Great. And so the successor, the Diadochi War, began. And once Perdiccas was killed, of course, you had Eurydice pushing for her husband, to be in power, to get more powers. And a lot of people thought that might happen, but of course it didn't, because of course he was slow and they didn't want to give him anything he really couldn't handle. So what happened was you had one of Philip of Macedonia, Alexander's father. You had one of his old lieutenants basically end up being voted in as being the new regent. So now Perdiccas is dead, and you have one of the lieutenants of Philip of Macedonia taking over as the regent. Now you would think with Philip being, so old and died a long time ago, anybody who served with him would be old. So Antipater, who was the lieutenant who served with Philip of Macedonia, he became regent. Now he wasn't regent for long because he died of natural causes, soon after. So everybody assumed that his son, Cassander, would take the place as regent. Because again, that's how things usually go. Your son succeeds you, becomes your successor. And Cassander thought that he would take the place if something happened to his father. And you had Eurydice, and you had her husband, who was her uncle. Gonna keep pointing that out because it's crazy. You had Eurydice and her uncle, Philip III, basically pushed for Cassander to be the new regent of Macedonia. Cassander had already aligned himself with Ptolemy the First Soter and the other Diadochi who was against Perdiccas. So, once he didn't get named ruler or regent, he was upset. Now, what happened was, instead of Cassander, son of Antipater, once he didn't get named, as I say, he was upset. A lot of people assumed he would get named. But what happened was, you had Polypersian, who was a friend of Antipater, one of his friends. He got named as the regent because he was, closest to the king and he knew how to rule. And Cassander wasn't really looked at as a person who was really, ready to rule. So you had Polypersian take over as regent, which pissed Cassander off, and a civil war began between Polypersian and Cassander. And basically, Polypersian was shocked that Cassander amassed the type of warriors that he did, because of course he was in with Ptolemy I Soter and the other Diadochi to basically, have this allegiance for one of them being, on the main throne. So when you look at the whole thing, you got to look at the seat of Alexander being the seat of power. So when you look at the 7 kingdoms in Game of Thrones, and you look at the fact that the Targaryen kingdom was like the main kingdom. They had the dragons, and they was the main kingdom over the 7 kingdoms and over really basically everything else. So whoever ruled that kingdom was considered, the ruler of the rest of the kingdoms. It's basically the same thing here in Greece. Whoever ruled Macedonia, whoever ruled the place in place of Alexander will be considered, the king of everything else. So they wanted it to be one of them, of course. So when you had Polypersian take over, Cassander go to war with him, and Cassander basically get help and have Ptolemy I Soter and Antigonus, which Antigonus was the one who basically destroyed the fleet of Polypersian. You had them come together and basically help him defeat Polypersian, which he fled. And eventually Cassander would basically try to take the throne. So now Polypersian was smart. He basically fled to Olympias, whatever Alexander's mother's name, how do you pronounce it? Olympias. He fled to her, and he fled to Roxana and Alexander IV, who was Alexander the Great son, who was the heir in waiting, So he fled there and basically pled to Olympias and said, hey, Cassander's taking over. This isn't the way it's supposed to go. Basically help him out. And what Olympias did, because she was powerful as well, she could fight. She had an army, and he basically got together the men that he had left who was willing to fight for him, and they amassed the army. While Cassander was away, they basically went back into Macedonia and defeated the army there and basically took back the kingdom. So you had Olympias go in there. And remember, now you have Olympias there, but who's also there is Eurydice and Philip III, named after her husband. So she understood that Philip III was being used, and as long as he was alive, he was a threat to the kingdom. So he had to go. So she killed him. She had him executed, and she forced Eurydice to commit suicide. So Philip III of Macedonia was executed 317 BCE, and his wife Eurydice was forced to commit suicide, and Olympus basically assumed control of the kingdom for a while. And she was basically, going on a rampage and killing everybody who she thought was a threat. She killed Cassander's brother, all of Cassander's commanders and his soldiers that was there. She executed a lot of them. And, she basically held on to the place for a while, I think over a year, until she was basically ambushed. She was basically caught in a blockade in Pitna. And Cassander caught her in a blockade and basically forced her to surrender. And he told her, if you surrender, then, you can keep your life. I'll let you live if you surrender. She surrendered. And of course, he didn't keep his word, but he ordered a bunch of soldiers to execute her, which they didn't do it. They didn't want to do it. Nobody wanted to be known as the person that killed Alexander's mother. So that was tough. So what he did was he got the family members of all the people that she executed, got her enemies, got everybody together, and they stoned her to death. Stoned her to death. And now Cassandra understood the only people that was in the way of him taking the throne was Alexander's son, Alexander IV, and his mother, Roxana. So what he did, I believe it was 309 BCE, when Alexander IV was 14 and getting ready to come in to age of being crowned king, he had them both poisoned. Poisoned them both. And you can look at it just like in Game of Thrones when Joffrey, the boy king, was poisoned. It's the same thing. You had Alexander IV poisoned at like 14. I think Joffrey was like older, like 19, something like that in Game of Thrones. But this is where the story is coming from. It's the same thing. All this stuff is coming from the same place. And this is what they do. They know how to take stories and actual history and then manipulate them. Manipulate the stories and plagiarize the stories to create something that they want to put out. But it's important that you know the story, which is why I'm telling it, because it's important you understand what happened and the kind of things that was taking place within those kingdoms. So you can see how unstable things was. So it's crazy. So eventually, Cassandra would crown himself king and take the throne and would rule for a while. So now we go back and you look at the only person left, as I mentioned before, was Cleopatra. Cleopatra was left, and the only person left that somebody could marry that could tie them to the throne and have some kind of stake in being, a true ruler or a person that had some kind of true claim to the throne. So yeah, Cleopatra eventually accept a proposal from Ptolemy I Soter to marry. But before she can get married, she was caught by Antigonus and she was killed. So again, this stuff kept happening. You had these wars. Nobody wanted anybody to really lay claim to the throne of Alexander unless it was them. So it was going to always be a war. Even people who they thought they was allies, they was going to fight. It was always going to be a battle for that throne, because that throne would be the throne to rule the rest of the thrones.